Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's nice through the past two panels to hear that there's quite a lot of areas of overlap and agreement about what needs to happen, and just the committee being interested in this gives me hope that we'll have improved legislation that better meets the needs of trafficked people. So everyone's been clear, there are no numbers, right? There are no accurate numbers to capture the scope of this. In large part, it's because it's illegal behaviors. And so from a research background, it's very hard to measure things that are clandestine. With that said, a lot of the data that does exist will say that more exploitation is happening in labor sectors outside of the sex industry than within it, although a lot of local and national attention is paid to sex trafficking. And so we'll see a discrepancy, like in the report that came out of the mayor's task force in San Francisco. They were very clear saying, oh, we feel like the numbers around sex trafficking are higher than that of labor trafficking because members of this task force weren't really focusing on other types of labor exploitation. So it really is dependent upon what people are measuring and the definitions that they're using. And so with a lot of my work most recently has focused on the experiences of young people involved in the sex industry, people who at the federal level and state level are being called domestic minor victims of sex trafficking. And I always think it's helpful to start off just with what the definition is to root us. And so it's any young person under the age of 18 trading sex in any capacity. So there doesn't have to be force, fraud, or coercion. There doesn't have to be a third party involved. There doesn't have to be movement across state line. So ultimately, it's reclassified a group of young people who've always existed with a new title. And with that, some people are saying we know nothing about this, and so we're starting from point zero. I would argue we know a lot about these young people. It's just that the terms have changed, and we can look back at research that's been done to help guide us. For example, in the work that I've done and others, Rick Curtis, Anthony Marcus in New York, about 10% of the young people that I've interviewed, their entry into the sex industry was by overt force. But that means 90% it's through other means. It's being pushed out of or running away from your home and needing a way to survive. It's trading sex to fulfill wants as opposed to needs. And for some young people, it's their parents and family members who are forcing them to trade sex. And so these are young people of all genders, races, and sexualities. And because of the diversity, it's pretty clear that no one model and no one policy approach is going to be suited to meet the needs of such a diverse group of young people. And so we need responses that reflect the diversity. And I think what's happened, especially in sort of the media, the main discourse, is of young girls forced into this against their will. And that does happen, and there's lots of other ways that young people are involved in the sex industry. And so to only focus on the narrative that maybe pulls our heartstrings the most is a disservice to the large group of young people who are also involved in the sex industry who could benefit from support and resources. The challenge, of course, is that most of these young people are involved in multiple service sectors. So it's child welfare involvement, it's juvenile justice, it's social services, and providing services becomes a challenge because interagency collaborations are often disjointed and maybe characterized by tensions between organizations around turf, around resources. And so we see a sort of disjointed and fragmented coordination of care, where some agencies are reluctant or even unwilling to share information about young people they're working with, which can lead to service delays, duplication of services. And so to best meet the needs of these young people, we need improved interagency collaboration. So I appreciate committee's members' commitment to this and saying, oh, we can find the money to support it. But there needs to be oversight of how the money is used and accountability on agencies to make sure that we're reaching the outcomes that we want to see for this group of young people. Another complication of service provision is that here in California, nationwide, internationally, when we speak to young people who are involved in the sex industry, they report experiencing violence more often from law enforcement officials than from other individuals, be it clients in the sex industry, be it intimate partners, family members. And so they've reported that they've been physically and sexually assaulted by police officers, Sometimes this happens in exchange for not being arrested. Sometimes it happens in the course of an undercover sting operation. A case manager was sharing with me the experience of a young woman she was working with in Southern California who said, oh, you know, this guy picked me up in the car and we were driving for about 5 minutes and he let me fondle him the entire time. Then it ended up this was a police officer and I was arrested. And if I'm a minor and he's a police officer, isn't that not supposed to happen? And so just at that basic level, it's discouraging. And then if we think about the implications for service provision, if young people see that service providers are working closely with law enforcement, they become a little suspicious and a little weary of it and are slower to open up and to trust them because of either this personal lived experience of negative interactions or the larger sort of conversation within their communities of hearing, this is what's happened to my friends. It's also a challenge that their behaviors are still criminalized. So California, we don't have a minimum age requirement in our prostitution laws. And I was going to mention this a little bit later, but it works in well here. Looking at data from the Attorney General's website that reports prostitution-related arrests. Compared to 2006, when Assembly Bill 22 was enacted, our human trafficking law, statewide we've seen a decrease of 68% in the number of young people arrested for prostitution offenses, which is great. I would prefer that it be 100%. In San Francisco County, where I'm based, we've seen that. So in 2014, there were no reported arrests of young people for prostitution-related offenses. In Alameda County, there's only been a...
Just to say that doesn't mean that there aren't children giving sex, but they're not arrested for it. They're instead treated as victims. Is that correct?
True.
Right.
But the point that I'm trying to make is that if we consider these young people to be victims, they shouldn't be arrested for prostitution-related offenses. And so we're seeing a trend statewide that it's moving in that direction. San Francisco has accomplished that. Alameda County, there's only been a 5% decrease from 2006 to 2014 in the number of young people arrested. So in 2006, it was 22 young people. In 2014, it was 21. So there's rooms for improvement. In terms of how to best establish trust with young people, because I think service providers nationwide will say that's one of the hardest things, is oftentimes a greater sort of entry point and introduction to a program is with low threshold services. So being able to come in, get food, a place to hang out, some showers, and basically have it no strings attached, that young people are accessing it on their own terms. And we need to be cautious about eligibility requirements. So in research I did in California, Illinois, and New York, 3 organizations had received funding from the Office for Victims of Crimes to serve domestic minor victims of human trafficking. And what they realized is because to be eligible for the program, they had to be able to confirm that these young people had either been forced to sell sex or sold sex as a minor or forced into other labor sectors. It made it very difficult to get young people enrolled because it required self-disclosure. And a lot of these young people do not think of themselves as trafficked. They're not going to share that they're trading sex. They're not going to talk about other forced labor situations. And so we want to figure out ways to make programs as accessible as possible for young people. We also want to make sure that their self-identified needs are met. So a number of people have already mentioned the pressing need for housing. And the 2012 report and also CAST's recommendation highlight that. A challenge for many of these young people is they're wanting to try to avoid child welfare involvement. And so many will forego going into shelter because they don't want their whereabouts reported. And so I think we really need to give some thought to innovative solutions that allow young people access to safe spaces, particularly at night, so that they're not in a position where they're trading sex for a place to stay. I think another really key need that young people identify for themselves are viable employment opportunities. And so this, again, is a challenge. These are young people under the age of 18. Many have not graduated high school or obtained a GED. They have limited to no legal work experience. And some have had the experience of making a seemingly large amount of money in a short amount of time through trading sex. And so some of the low-wage, entry-level jobs that are available don't provide what they consider to be a living wage. And so we need to think about some innovative solutions to address the economic needs of these young people so that for those who are trading sex to survive and it's fulfilling economic necessity, they have a viable alternative to meet that need. I think it's also important that we evaluate what's currently happening. So the 2012 State of California sort of human trafficking report highlighted the need for increased law enforcement training. And with Proposition 35, there's the 2-hour required training for law enforcement officials around human trafficking. So I sit on a subcommittee of the mayor's task force, anti-human trafficking task force in San Francisco, and it's the Sex Work and Trafficking Policy Impact Committee. And we reviewed that video saying we should know what's happening and see what's working well and what's not. And unfortunately, the training leaves the more complicated nature of human trafficking unexamined. So it focuses exclusively on young cisgender women, so individuals born female whose gender identity matches their biological sex, who have a third party forcing them to trade sex. But no guidance is given on how to work with LGBTQ young people, young cisgender men, or with young people who are not being exploited by a third party. The training also conflates all forms of sex work with trafficking and makes the unsubstantiated claim that most people trading sex have a pimp. So research has shown among young people, at most around 57% of young people will have someone who fits the criteria of a pimp, although many of those young people would never call that person a pimp, and that most were first exploited as minors. So again, speaking to the need of data, we hear this a lot, that most people in the industry started off when they were youth. And the reality is with measurement, if you only have samples of people under the age of 18, the age of entry is going to be under 18. And in those studies, it ends up being between 15 and 17. But if we look at studies that include adults involved in the sex industry over 18, the average age of entry typically falls around 22 years old. So to me, that indicates not everyone starts off when they're young, and not everyone goes on. So
if you could summarize in about 1 minute.
Sure. So I will skip ahead. Mentioned about arrest rates, mentioned that we need more oversight of trainings that have already been created to ensure accurate content and identify where the gaps are. And I would say that, in the last minute, a more holistic and nuanced picture of young people who trade sex clearly demonstrates that campaigns focusing on ratcheting up penalties for third parties or clients will not in and of themselves solve this issue. And that most of our current laws and policies in some ways might be associated with increased vulnerability for young people because the structural factors associated with them becoming involved in the sex industry or with other exploited labor aren't being addressed. We're not looking at these root factors and instead are prioritizing the needs of the state and prosecution over the needs of people who are experiencing exploitation. And so this rational approach to deviance, if we just make the penalty severe enough, the issue will go away. It doesn't really work, right? It hasn't worked in the war on drugs. It's going to have limited validity here. And I recognize that it's much harder to tackle issues like poverty and homophobia and transphobia and racism, which are some of the structural factors associated with the vulnerabilities that lead to exploitive conditions. But if we really want to improve people's lives so that they don't find that they're in a situation where trading sex is their least worst or their best option, or that they're in a situation where they're forced into it against their will, we need to start taking on those bigger battles.
Thank you very much. Deborah, people who are perhaps in the country illegally, but they're here voluntarily knowing they were going to be in the sex trade industry. Does that also happen?
I might want to broaden that out to the panel. I haven't seen that in our area.
All right, that's fine. I know, Alexandra, you apparently have an answer to that. Does that also exist?
Yeah, I think people try to get into this country for a lot of really good reasons, and sometimes their way in is knowing someone's going to help them get across the border, get into the country, and in exchange, they're going to be involved in prostitution to pay back whatever fees for helping them migrate. And so they're aware of the dynamic that they're agreeing to, and that seems like their best option for getting to a country where they think they'll have more opportunities.
Mm-hmm. So there, it's very important probably to have the UNT visas available.